Hey everybody, this is chapter 4 of part 2 of Gustav A. Vetter's Dialectical Materialism, a Historical and Systematic Survey. Chapter 4 is titled The Theory of Categories. For purposes of making the uploading videos and labeling them and naming them a little easier on the YouTube, I've in the description or in the title, it doesn't say that this is from part 2 of the book. It refers to this chapter as chapter 15. So here we go. The laws of the materialist dialectic dealt with in the preceding chapter merely reproduce the most fundamental patterns of development. They are required to be supplemented by the categories of this dialectic, which enrich the Marxist dialectical method with new features and aspects. In Soviet accounts of dialectical materialism appearing prior to 1938, the theory of categories normally followed as a separate chapter after the treatment of the basic laws of the materialist dialectic. In the textbooks published after 1938, which adhered slavishly to the structure of Stalin's dialectical and historical materialism, in which the theory of categories was omitted, the main core categories were dealt with under one or two of the, quote, principal features, and quote, of the dialectical method, wherever they seemed, on the whole, to fit in best. After Stalin's death, as people began to emancipate themselves from the authority of the above-mentioned work, the theory of categories featured as one of the most important points, which were now rehandled in great detail. The concept of, quote, category is not very accurately formulated. The short philosophical dictionary gives the following definition. Categories represent, quote, the basic logical concepts reflecting the most general and essential properties, aspects and relations of things, and phenomena in reality, end quote. Tugarinov likewise asserts, quote, the philosophical categories are concepts designating the most general objects, properties, aspects, and connections in reality, end quote. If these definitions are compared with that generally employed in philosophy, the root concepts or highest genera, from which all other concepts are derived, and which cannot themselves be referred to any other higher genus, the vague nature of the Soviet definition of a, quote, category immediately becomes clear. Soviet authors commonly distinguish between the categories employed in the special sciences and philosophical categories which retain their validity in every field of knowledge. The categories of physics, for example, include mass, substance, light, energy, atom, etc., those of biology, life, species, inheritance, etc. The basic categories of dialectical materialism as listed by the short philosophical dictionary are matter, motion, time, space, quality, quantity, reciprocal connection, contradiction, causality, necessity, form and content, essence and appearance, possibility and actuality, etc. Those of historical materialism, mode of production, socioeconomic formation, productive forces, production relations, basis and superstructure, classes, revolution, etc. Rosenthal and Strax deal in their monograph with the following categories: appearance and essence, cause and effect, necessity and contingency, law, content and form, possibility and actuality, singular, particular and general, abstract and concrete, and historical and logical. This catalogue of fundamental categories creates an impression of great arbitrariness. In his day, the Debornist Gonnickman had proposed, quote, a closed system of dialectical categories, end quote, which was to begin and also to conclude with the category of being. This point of view was at that time rejected by a resolution of the party cell in the Institute of Red Professors. Obichkin, on this occasion, protested against such a view on the ground that, quote, in the materialist dialectic, there is no closed or complete system of categories, nor can there be such a thing. All that can be spoken of is a systematic account of the laws and categories which truly reflect the dialectic of reality, a further working out of these, and the exploration of new categories representing hitherto unknown forms of material motion." End quote. This standpoint is also echoed in the edition of Rosenthal and Euden's short philosophical dictionary. Quote, "The categories of dialectical and historical materialism, like those of any other science, do not constitute a closed and unalterable system of basic concepts." End quote. This same Rosenthal insists, however, in the first chapter, which forms part of his contribution to the already oft-quoted collection, The Categories of the Materialist Dialectic, that, quote, "The connection and interaction of the categories, their reciprocal transitions, require us to approach them not as mechanical series of concepts, but as a unitary system of categories, having a definite inner structure and a definite order of transition from one category to another." End quote. M. Rosenthal and G.M. Strax. But how are we to imagine a, quote, "unitary system with a, quote, definite inner structure," end quote, without it also having a certain degree of closure, is not immediately evident. Rosenthal bases his demand for a, quote, "unitary, internally structured system of categories" on a passage from Engels, who in his Dialectics of Nature had argued that the dialectical logic requires a subordination of the forms of judgment and conclusion. Quote, "Dialectical logic, in contrast to the old, merely formal logic, is not like the merely formal logic, content with enumerating the forms of motion of thought, i.e., the various forms of judgment and conclusion, and placing them side by side without any connection. On the contrary, dialectical logic derives from forms out of one another. It makes one subordinate to another instead of putting them on an equal level. It develops the higher forms out of the lower." End quote. Engels. What Engels here insists on for the forms of judgment and conclusion, Rosenthal also applies to the theory of categories. They must in some way reflect the historical development of human knowledge. The question as to the part played by one or other of these categories in the various stages of this process is of first-rate importance for the theory of knowledge. When Kant opens his table of categories with those of quantity, this is already a mistake, since both the development of science and the experience of the individual in Kant's own thinking provide evidence of the fact that qualitative relations are grasped earlier than quantitative relations. Thus, the qualitative differences between colors, for example, leap to the eye at once, whereas their quantitative basis, the various wavelengths, are only grasped at a relatively late stage. A more interesting attempt, and one that is original within Soviet philosophy, to classify the categories on the basis of their subordination, has been undertaken by Professor V.B. Tugarinov of Leningrad University. Like Descartes, Spinoza, and Locke, and Aristotle before them, who in addition to his well-known list of 10 categories, also postulated a threefold division into things, properties, and relations, Tugarinov divides the categories into three groups. Quote, "The group of object or substratum categories, nature, being, matter, appearance, the group of categories reflecting the most general properties of nature, motion, change, development, space, time, objective, subjective, consciousness, thought, and the extensive group of categories which give expression to the ties and relations between phenomena and the properties thereof, such as necessity, contingency, content, form, causality, purposiveness, possibility, actuality, general, particular, singular, etc. We shall call the first group substantial, the second attributive, and the third relative correlative categories. Subordination also occurs among the categories of any one group within the above threefold division of the objects that make up reality." End quote. V.P. Tugarinov. Within the third group, according to Tugarinov, subordination appears in the fact that the categories most closely associated are ordered in definite, quote, "nests." Among these labels he lists, quote, "quality, quantity, gradualness, leap, substratum, essentiality, appearance, content, form, general, particular, singular, identity, unity, difference, opposition, contradiction, conflict, causality, necessity, contingency, possibility, probability, actuality, necessity, purposiveness, goal, freedom, law, regularity, and objective, relative, absolute truth, end quote. The alleged impossibility of setting up a, quote, closed system of categories is defended in the short philosophical dictionary on the ground that, quote, the number and content of the scientific categories becomes enriched in accordance with the development of objective reality and the progress of scientific knowledge, end quote. And that, quote, as an expression of the essential connections in reality, end quote, the categories, quote, must necessarily be as mobile, elastic, and coherent as the objects and processes of the material world itself, end quote. Short Philosophical Dictionary. Thus, production of goods, for example, is one thing under capitalism and another under socialism. It engenders capitalism only where there is private ownership of the means of production, but whereas in the Soviet Union the means of production are socially owned, commodity production helps to reinforce the establishment of socialism. Turgenev is more far-sighted on this point in that he freely acknowledges the correlation of categories to be, quote, stable, even though it is not absolutely stationary and immobile. Quote, in conformity with the demands of practice and the development of science, new categories emerge, new connections are disclosed within them, and the mutual relations of one to another grow richer and more complex, end quote. Turgenev. At this stage, we may leave open the question whether, with the development of science, new categories require to be added to the current list of high-level concepts, in order, for example, to take account of the facts discovered by modern quantum physics. There may be some point in supposing the theory of categories to be capable of alteration in this respect. But when such possibilities of alteration are understood to mean that one and the same category, possibility, say, has one meaning today and may perhaps have a different meaning 1,000 years hence, this is a view that must be rejected as absurd. One day, perhaps, we may recognize things that are nowadays thought possible to be impossible, and conversely, many things will prove to be possible which are nowadays regarded as impossible. But the situation referred to under the concept of, quote, possible will always remain the same, meaning by this, roughly, quote, something that under given conditions can become or be thought of as actual, end quote. Of the example of commodity production, it may be said that no internal change is implied in an object or phenomenon by the fact that it produces different effects under differing external circumstances. New section, Section 1, Appearance, Essence, and Law. The first pair of categories dealt with in the collective volume, titled The Categories of the Materialist Dialectic, is that of, quote, appearance and essence, end quote. But since the category of law presupposes that of essence, we shall discuss it here along with the other two. In Stalin's day, the categories of appearance and essence were normally treated as part of the theory of knowledge. In the knowing process and in practical activity, man is primarily concerned with the individual. But scientific knowledge cannot be content with this, for scientific knowledge's task is to detect the general and permanent, the essence in the individual and in concrete phenomena. In practical activity, man proceeds, quote, from knowledge of the appearance to knowledge of its essence. Quote, from knowledge of the appearance to knowledge of its essence, from the immediate and external to the mediate and internal, end quote. The definitions which dialectical materialism attaches to the concepts of, quote, essence and, quote, appearance are again very inexact, being descriptions in effect rather than definitions. Quote, essence is the internal, relatively stable aspect of objective reality, hidden under the surface of appearances and finding expression therein, end quote. Quote, essence gives expression to the main features characterizing objects, the inner and most important aspects, the underlying processes that go on in them, end quote. Quote, essence is the element of generality presented in appearances, end quote. It is, quote, the unity of the appearances, end quote. But in order to eliminate the conception of essence as an inner substantial principle, Turgenev locates it in a purely internal similarity among things. Quote, essence is the common factor exhibited in the external aspect, and in no sense an inner substance of any kind, end quote. V.P. Turgenev. The category of appearance is similarly defined. Quote, appearance is the outer, more mobile and changeable aspect of objective reality and represents a form in which essence is expressed. End quote. Tugarinov. Quote, appearance is the outward expression of essence, the external form presented on the surface by the objects and processes in reality. End quote. Tugarinov. Actually, I don't think those quotes are actually Tugarinov. So, or I'm not sure. The formatting of this book is very bad. This distinction between essence and appearance, the conception of essence as something hidden behind the phenomena, has pervaded human thought throughout its entire history. Indeed, according to dialectical materialism, a similar tendency is already to be found in the animal kingdom. The images which animals form of their own kind already manifest a rudimentary capacity for abstraction. While in cracking nuts and so forth, they likewise exhibit a certain proficiency in analysis. In the course of labor, man has since released himself from the embrace of nature and developed the ability to recognize natural laws and thereby dominate over nature. As soon as there was anything at all resembling philosophic thought, the Eleatics, it endeavored to seize on the essence of all things. In the Middle Ages, however, the doctrine of, quote, unchanging essences, end quote, endowed the concept of essence with a quote, metaphysical character, and Kant, with his doctrine of, quote, things in themselves, later opened up a deep metaphysical rift between essence and appearance, which is only bridged by Hegel's repudiation of an unchanging, immobile, otherworldly essence, and in Hegel's theory of the essence as manifesting itself in the phenomena. Even so, Hegel's doctrine of essence was still an idealistic one. The category of essence first took on a, quote, profoundly materialistic sense, end quote, in the writings of Marx, who differed from the vulgar materialist in that he by no means rejected this category. In the third part of Capital, he says quite explicitly that if the phenomenal form and the essence of things were to coincide exactly, all science would be superfluous. Herewith some examples of this, quote, profoundly materialist conception, end quote, of the categories of essence and appearance, the basic contradiction in the capitalist order of society between social character of production and the individual character of appropriation is seen as the essence which defines expression in a variety of phenomena, in the struggle between capital and labor, in economic crises, unemployment, war, etc. Labor is to be regarded in like fashion as the common essence in which the diversity of goods finds its unity. A further example is provided by Lenin in his polemic against Kautsky. Quote, the forms of the bourgeois state are extremely varied, but in essence they are all the same. In one way or another, in the last analysis, all these states are inevitably a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. End quote. Lenin, State and Revolution. This unity of essence and appearance is conceived, however, as a, quote, dialectical, quote, contradictory, end quote, unity. The appearance is and is not identical with the essence. The appearance expresses the essence adequately, and again, it does not. Moreover, the dialectical unity of the two is realized in a mutual transformation of one into the other. Quote, we see the transition, the overflow of one into the other. The essence appears, the appearance is essential, end quote. Hence, it is not enough to discover the essence merely by freeing the core from inessentials. One must also examine the motion of the essence, its becoming, its transformation into the appearance, which is also at the same time its, quote, actualization. Thus, the essence appears not as an immovable dead abstraction, but as the, quote, interconnection of appearances according to law, end quote. M.B. Mitten. The category of essence is connected with that of law, for, quote, law is the reflection of what is essential in the motion of the universe, end quote. In elaborating this category, dialectical materialism sets out from the Hegelian formula, quote, law, ... is essential appearance, end quote, a definition which Lenin takes over word for word. In appealing thus to the Hegelian concept of law, which represents it as a relation between the essence of things, dialectical materialism is seeking to stress that law must not be regarded as an external force standing in opposition to appearance, but as an inner tendency on the part of the phenomena themselves. This category, too, exhibits a dialectical character. This comes out in the first place in the fact that law is in one respect superior to the phenomena, but in another is subordinate to them. Law only has regard to what is constant in phenomena, the universal element. It leaves out of account the whole multitude of individual peculiarities, which in fact are always bound up with particular phenomena. As Lenin therefore puts it, quote, law seizes on the constant, and hence any law is narrow, incomplete, approximate, end quote. And, quote, the phenomenon is richer than the law, end quote. Lenin. On the other hand, however, the law is superior to the phenomenon, since the law covers and expresses a multitude of individual instances, is necessarily realized in those instances, and represents the constant features of phenomena. In this sense, law expresses a deeper knowledge of the world, end quote. Sorry, I don't know why I said end quote. There's no quote there. Before the appearance of Stalin's last work, Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR, it was still customary to follow Engels in laying great stress on another aspect of the, quote, dialectical character of law, namely on the relative, quote, historical character of both natural and social laws. As we have already seen, Engels is firmly opposed to all final solutions and eternal truths. By the same token, there is a corresponding repudiation of any quote, fetishistic, simple-minded view of the absolute character of law. Marx is referred to as having shown in his Capital that there are no permanent economic laws valid for all time, and Engels has done the same for the laws of nature, having demonstrated that, quote, even the universal, absolute, eternal laws of nature, are essentially historical laws, historic in the sense that they emerge in different ways, under different conditions, at different stages in the development of nature, end quote. Engels. Thus, the laws governing the life and development of plants and animals cannot be eternal, if only for the reason that it is not until organisms have arisen and the conditions for their life are present that these laws come into play. Even the law that water remains fluid at a temperature from 0 to 100 degrees Celsius depends on the Earth's state of geological evolution and might well be subject to modification on the moon or the sun. Since the publication of the above-mentioned work of Stalin's, however, there has been little further said on this point. Instead, the emphasis has all been put upon the objective character of the laws of nature and social development and their independence of the human will. Even the socialist society develops in accordance with objective laws. In the definition of the categories of, quote, essence and appearance, we are again forcibly struck by that imprecision, not to say ineptitude in the formulation of concepts, which is typical of Soviet philosophy. This is partly bound up with the fact that dialectical materialism never draws any precise distinction between thing and process, quote, thing and, quote, phenomenon being frequently mentioned in the same breath as if they were synonymous. But above all, this confusion is due to the basic attitude of dialectical materialism in consciously denying the element of stability in reality. Given such an assumption, it is naturally not easy to provide for the concepts of, quote, essence and, quote, law. This is also connected with the existence of an evident conflict within dialectical materialism on precisely this basis, namely between the measure of positivism already injected by Engels and a truly philosophical treatment of the question. When Marx observes that essence and phenomenon cannot coincide, since otherwise all science would be superfluous, then when dialectical materialism insists that scientific research must involve penetrating behind the external appearance into the, quote, depth of things and phenomena, they are both evidently swayed unconsciously by the idea of something resembling a world accessible only to thought, a sort of cosmos noetos, But in order to avoid having to assume the existence of such ideal principles in the world, spasmodic efforts are then made to iron out this, quote, deeper level, on purely empirical lines, into the sum of the relations obtaining between individual things. As for Engels' assertion that all laws are relative and have only a historically conditioned validity, the answer to that is that the absence of conditions for the application of a law offers no ground whatever for concluding that the law is invalid. The fact is, in any case, that science always takes great pains to incorporate into the formulation of science's laws a statement of the conditions under which they hold good, as for instance in defining the boiling point of water. New section, Section 2, Causality and Finality. One of the most important categories involved in the problem of universal connection, and the most important form of connection between phenomena in nature and society, is that of causality. By cause is meant a, quote, phenomenon which precedes another and gives rise to the latter, end quote. An effect, on the other hand, is, quote, a phenomenon which follows upon another and constitutes its outcome, end quote. M.A. Leonov. Friction causes heat. Private ownership of the means of production causes exploitation, causes the class struggle. It should be noted in this connection that Leonov conceives the linkage of cause and effect to be a necessary one. Quote, the causal nexus between phenomena consists in this, that one phenomenon necessarily gives rise to another, end quote. A distinction must be drawn between the prime cause, the deciding of determining cause, the immediate cause, and the occasion, the role of the latter being to accelerate the emergence of the effect. If the prime cause of economic crises under capitalism is the contradiction between the social character of production and the individual character of appropriation, the immediate cause of such crises must be seen in a chronic failure of demand, while the occasion may lie in the bankruptcy of some individual bank or trust. Particular importance is also attached to the concept of, quote, condition. Leonov understands by a condition, quote, a complex of phenomena in whose absence a given phenomenon can either arise or can neither rise nor continue to exist. End quote. Quote, a totality of circumstances which prepare the way for the emergence of this or that object and determine its existence. End quote. Although these definitions are not particularly clear and scarcely bring out the difference between a condition and a cause, Leonov nevertheless asserts quite plainly that the connection between condition and conditioned is not the same as that between cause and effect, and also produces an example to illustrate the point. Parenthesis, air is a condition, not a cause of human life, end parenthesis. Parenthesis, air is a condition, not a cause of human life, end parenthesis. Dialectical materialism does indeed allow that for purposes of exact research into natural connections, cause and effect must necessarily be considered in isolation and picked out from the total web of appearances. But this is only relative significance and is permissible only on condition that, in doing so, the totality of connections and the reciprocal interaction prevailing among individual phenomena should not be left out of sight. For Engels, indeed, interaction is the most fundamental of all categories. In dialectical materialism, nature as a whole is seen as a vast organism, determining itself without requiring an impulse from outside. Matter is substance, and substance is causa sui, very much as it is in Spinoza, who is consciously echoed at this point. All the things in the world are in mutual connection and condition one another. Here too, however, as so often before, we must again draw attention to the lack of any clear definition of the concepts involved. Nowhere is it exactly stated that what interaction is supposed to cover, and the term is frequently applied to situations where there is really no true interaction at all. Quote, it is just the same, end quote, says Engels, quote, with cause and effect. These are conceptions which only have validity in their application to a particular case as such. But when we consider the particular case and its general connection with the world as a whole, they merge and dissolve in the conception of universal action and interaction, in which causes and effects are constantly changing places, and what is now or here an effect becomes here or becomes there or then a cause, and vice versa. End quote. Owing to this fugitive character of relations of dependence within the world's interconnectedness, it is difficult to discover the causal connections operative in an individual case. Leonov gives the following rules for doing so. A. In the first place, the causal nexus between two phenomena may be indicated by their temporal succession. However, here Leonov goes so far as to maintain that the cause always precedes its effect. To suppose it possible for cause and effect to be simultaneous would amount to allowing the entire world process to shrivel up into a single instant. From the necessary temporal successiveness of cause and effect, Leonov goes on to infer that the cause and effect relation is not a reversible one. The effect which follows from the cause cannot be the cause of the phenomenon which precedes it. He simply fails to notice that in so saying he rules out the possibility of any true, quote, interaction of the kind which dialectical materialism so emphatically declares to be of supreme importance in explaining the word process. B. It is not very temporal succession, however, that betokens a causal nexus. Dialectical materialism is by no means disposed to argue post hoc, ergo propter hoc. That is taken to be the view adopted in contemporary, quote, bourgeois philosophy, which thereby calls in question the ideas of causality and law and gives encouragement to every kind of superstition. Only superstitious peasants would attribute a fall of rain to a church procession, for example, and only blockheads would try to connect the appearance of the comet of 1812 with Napoleon's invasion of Russia, which occurred soon afterwards. The constant succession of two phenomena may indeed point, on occasion, to a cause common to them both, as for instance with the regular succession of day and night, but even when two phenomena regularly occur together at the same time, this is no ground for presuming them to be causally connected. C. Such successions on the part of two phenomena can only be regarded as instances of causal connection where one not only precedes the other but also gives rise to it. In addition to the category of cause, dialectical materialism is also a staunch upholder of the universal validity of the causal principle. We shall be seeing in the following chapter how energetically the latter is defended against certain exponents of modern physics. If we ask, however, for a theoretical justification of its validity, we do not get much of an answer. At best, it is held sufficient to appeal, with Engels, to the mere fact of human activity, in the sense, that is, that human activity makes it possible to demonstrate the fact of causality. As, for instance, when we strike a match and observe that the friction first produces heat and then flame. In developing its doctrine of causality, dialectical materialism is chiefly concerned with two views which it considers to be erroneous. One is that held by those philosophers who seek to construe causality as a purely subjective category, whether it be a question of Kant's idealism or Mach's empirio-criticism, or of the attempts made by many modern physicists to replace the causal law, like all other laws of nature, I lost my spot. Or of the attempts made by many modern physicists to replace the causal law, like all other laws of nature, by functional relationships, and thereby reduce them to differential equations. The other view of causality attacked by Soviet philosophy is that of the mechanist, who sought to reduce all causality to the mechanical variety. As against this, Soviet philosophy very properly insists that mechanical causality, by external impulse, is only the lowest form of causality in general. And that besides this, the world also contains a whole series of other types of causal linkage, such as the chemical, the biological, or the social, which differ from mechanical causality in producing qualitative changes. Lenin is surprised that in Hegel's logic the problem of causality, which plays such a large part in the history of philosophy, is not treated at greater length. He finds the explanation of the fact in this, that, quote, causality as we ordinarily understand it, end quote, is, quote, only a small portion of the universal interconnection between things, end quote. The problem of causality also confronts the Soviet philosophers with the problem of finality. Does the world contain efficient causes only, or are there formal causes as well? Or, to retain the terminology of dialectical materialism, is there causality merely, this being conceived solely in terms of efficient causes, or is there also finality? Here too, Soviet philosophy takes issue against two opposing factions and proclaims the inseparable connection of cause and purpose, bourgeois philosophy being again accused of disregarding this connection. On the one hand, there is a further assault on mechanism which completely denies the existence of finality in the world and seeks to explain everything in terms of causality, efficient causes. On the other hand, however, objection is also taken to the attempt to separate finality from causality, or even to prefer it to the latter. This being precisely what is complained of in idealism, that in contrast to the materialist conception of objective causality, it brings forward the concept of, quote, purpose, as apparently holding sway throughout the whole of nature. From this teleological standpoint, every phenomenon is the realization of a purpose, urging it to development and completion. This is taken to be yet another relic of the religious conception of, quote, providence, this having been replaced in the course of the progressive development of productive forces by the teleological mode of apprehension. The latter no longer locates the purpose outside the things themselves, but reposes it in them, a theory generally deriving from Aristotle, which subsequently gained special favor in Leibniz's monadology and theory of pre-established harmony, and has lately found expression in vitalism, Dreich, As against these conceptions, dialectical materialism puts forward its own doctrine of the, quote, sole scientific explanation of finality, end quote, claiming that it unifies the causal and the final modes of approach, and in such a manner as to bring about the primacy of the causal mode, and to offer scope for finality only as a special manifestation of causality. Dialectical materialism is, quote, strenuously opposed to finality in nature, and teaches that everything takes place by virtue of the operation of objective causes. Goal-seeking is only present in human behavior, and even there it depends on man's objective conditions of existence, especially on the material living conditions of society, end quote. M.A. Leonov. In the realm of nature, therefore, all finality is repudiated. Admittedly, nature furnishes a mass of examples of startling purposiveness, but since Darwin, such purposiveness has been held to be causally explicable as an outcome of, quote, natural selection, end quote, chance variations in organisms which improve their adaptation to the struggle for existence, get handed down by inheritance to their descendants, whereas the less resistant individuals perish in the struggle for existence. In Soviet opinion, this theory of Darwin's deals a devastating blow against the teleological point of view. Engels, indeed, had already waxed ironical at the expense of the Wolffian teleology, quote, or the Wolffian teleology, quote, according to which cats were created to eat mice, mice to be eaten by cats, and the whole of nature to testify to the wisdom of the Creator, end quote. Engels' Dialectics of Nature. In the realm of human activity, however, and especially in the social field, dialectical materialism is by no means inclined to dispute the validity of final causes. Marx and Engels consider the conscious pursuit of goals as the characteristic distinction between social activity and natural processes. We have already had occasion to notice how Marx finds in purposeful activity the essential factor which ultimately distinguishes the work of the most impotent architect from that of the best of bees. One of the most important doctrines of Marxism is actually built on the validity of final causes in the social sphere, namely the theory of the class struggle. That is particularly true of Lenin, who fought with the utmost energy against the beliefs of certain Russian Marxists. The social development would automatically lead to socialism. The theory of stick-enost, or passive waiting, and on behalf of a conscious, purposeful struggle for the socialist order of society, is precisely this which led him to the most individual creation of his career. The Bolshevik Party, whose task it was to import consciousness and purpose into the spontaneous process of social evolution. In appraising the dialectical materialist doctrine of causality, we may again begin by acknowledging some positive merits. Most especially, we may applaud its defense of the objective validity of the causal concept against any sort of subjectivism, and of the universal validity of the causal law against certain tendencies in modern quantum physics, even though nothing is done to provide a theoretical justification of the causal law. In general, too, we may accept the definitions given of the concept of cause, in spite of the fact that they not infrequently exhibit that inaccurate manner of framing concepts so typical of Soviet philosophy and already long since familiar. The separating out of essentially distinct types of causality in different fields of reality, mechanical, chemical, social, etc., is quite correct. Finally, we must acknowledge the moderation displayed by dialectical materialism, unlike other forms of materialism, in that it does not do away at once with final causes and does at least allow them validity in the field of human activity. However, however, we encounter the crucial point at which dialectical materialism breaks down, in that dialectical materialism believes it possible to account for these evident proofs of purposiveness within the realm of nature in purely causal terms, by reference to efficient causes only. Here it appeals to the Darwinian law of natural selection, but since the category of, quote, contingency, unquote, plays a part in this explanation, we must postpone examining it in greater detail for the time being. In contending that finality is also operative in the realm of nature, we are by no means wishing to maintain by this that it somehow replaces causality, or makes it superfluous. Even where finality is at work, it realizes itself by way of efficient causes. When organisms acquire a particular form adapted to their environment, when roots grow downwards, whereas the stem and branches grow up, this all takes place by virtue of the operation of efficient causes. But these efficient causes are not in themselves sufficient to explain the purposiveness in nature. We may therefore agree with Mitten when he protests against the separation of the question, quote, why, from the question, quote, wherefore. We cannot accept the conclusion he draws from this, quote, any complete account of a given phenomenon, any explanation of, quote, why that phenomenon occurs, also contains in itself the explanation of, quote, wherefore, unquote, to what purpose the given phenomenon occurs. Once we have explained how the eyes are adapted to a purpose, we have also made clear in the process, quote, wherefore, unquote, they are so constructed. This is simply untrue. End quote. M.B. Mitten. This is simply untrue. The causal explanation of the origin of the eye tells us nothing whatever, as yet, about the purpose the eye serves in the organism, nor again does a causal explanation as to the physiological changes in the organism of a migrant bird, which induce it to seek a warmer climate, throw any greater light on the purpose for which it does so, namely to secure its own preservation. Section 3. Necessity and Contingency. The problem of freedom. In dealing with this category, dialectical materialism is confronted with a problem that has always had notably ominous implications for Marxist philosophy, since it has invariably led to the disclosure of an underlying contradiction in Marxism. This is the problem of determinism. Soviet philosophy shows itself not unskillful, however, in evading the full weight of the problem, in that it follows the example of Hegel's logic, in contrasting the necessary with the, quote, accidental, rather than with freedom. Quote, accidental for Hegel meant the same thing as, quote, contingent. Quote, accordingly, we consider the contingent to be what may or may not be, what may or may be in one way or in another, whose being or not being, and whose being on this wise or otherwise, depends not upon itself, but on something else. End quote. This way of putting the matter effectively reduces the problem of determinism to that of necessary and contingent being, and the Soviet philosopher's definition of the concept of necessity, or in accordance with this. The Short Philosophical Dictionary takes necessity to be, quote, that which is rooted in the essence of phenomena and processes as such, which proceeds from the inner connections and relations among things in its fundamental aspects, cannot be other than it is, end quote. Short Philosophical Dictionary. Stranger still is the definition given in the collective work Categories of the Materialist Dialectic. Quote, by necessity, dialectical materialism understands that which has its cause in itself, which arises inevitably and lawfully from the essence itself, and from the inner connection among things, processes, and events, and which must, in the main, inevitably occur in this fashion, and not in any other way. End quote. Rosenthal Strax. But when I let go of a stone and it falls to earth, this is certainly a necessary occurrence, even though the cause does not reside in the stone itself. The concept of contingency is similarly defined. Quote, contingency is that which has its ground and cause not in itself, not in the essence of phenomena, processes, events, and things as such, but in something else, something which does not arise from inner connections and relations, but from ancillary or external connections, and hence may either be or not be, may occur in this or in some other way. End quote. The concept of necessity is a presupposition of all science. Where necessary connection is absent, says Engels in the Dialectics of Nature, science comes to an end. Such determinism should not, however, be interpreted too strictly. That would conflict with Lenin's campaign against Stalinism of the earlier Russian Marxists, whose position is denounced by the official Soviet philosophy as, quote, fatalism, in that it leaves no room for man's conscious activity or the proletarian struggle for emancipation. In order, therefore, to provide a certain scope within Marxist determinism for the Leninist notion of Znaznatelnost, Soviet philosophy distinguishes between a, quote, mechanistic and a, quote, dialectical determinism, and holds it a reproach to, quote, metaphysics, that quote, metaphysics ascribes exclusive validity either to the category of necessity or else to that of contingency, whereas dialectical materialism proclaims a, quote, dialectical unity, end quote, of contingency and necessity. The, quote, abstract mechanistic type of determinism recognizes only necessity. Such was the position of Democritus in antiquity, who asserted that men had set up the idol of chance in order to conceal their own lack of understanding. Spinoza, too, like the, quote, metaphysical materialists of the 18th century, rejected the notion of contingency. The hot-bloodedness of a conqueror, the dyspepsia of a monarch, were regarded as sufficient to account for the outbreak of wars, the onset of famines, and the like. The course of history hung upon the beauty of Cleopatra or the cold in Napoleon's head. Engels derided such, quote, metaphysics in the Dialectics of Nature, quote, that a particular pea pod contains 5 peas and not 4 or 6, that a particular dog's tail is 5 inches long and not a whit longer or shorter, ... that last night I was bitten by a flea at 4 o'clock in the morning, and not at 3 or 5 o'clock, and on the right shoulder and not on the left calf. Unquote. These facts are supposedly, quote, produced by an irrevocable concatenation of cause and effect, by an unshatterable necessity of such a nature, indeed that the gaseous sphere, from which the solar system was derived, was already so constituted that these events had to happen thus and not otherwise, end quote. Engels, Dialectics of Nature. The manner in which mechanism introduced a, quote, abstract determinism of this sort into Soviet philosophy was somewhat different from this, in that it supposed, quote, contingent to mean that it, in that it supposed, fuck that up. Supposed, not supposed. Supposed. The manner in which mechanism introduced a, quote, abstract determinism of this sort into Soviet philosophy was somewhat different from this, in that mechanism supposed, quote, contingent to mean, quote, uncaused, and therefore treated contingency as a purely subjective category, a mere product of thought, having no counterpart in objective reality. The opposing, quote, metaphysical faction, on the other hand, denies necessity and will hear of nothing except contingency, but in so doing it also denies the presence of objective law in nature and society. Hegel is given great credit for having attempted to bridge the gulf between necessity and contingency, and to view these two categories in their dialectical unity. Hegel's idealism, however, prevented Hegel from attaining the complete success eventually granted for the first time to Marx and Engels. Their dialectical materialism has resulted in a truly dialectical concept of determinism, in which necessity does not exclude contingency, but combines with it to form a dialectical unity. Each category presupposes the other, and each transforms itself into the other. Hence, contingency too has become an objective category, an objective form of the causal nexus. It is both a completion and a manifestation of necessity. For contingency does not mean, as the mechanist held, the absence of causation. Even the contingent is causally conditioned, and in this sense necessary. If this is the true state of affairs, where then does the real difference between contingency and necessity lie? In their own day, the Debornists drew this distinction in the following manner. Everything is contingent which proceeds, not from the inner nature of a thing, but as a result of, quote, a conjunction of the fundamental law of this thing with special laws of another order, end quote. Thus, the fact that the leader of the Russian Revolution was born in Simbirsk is not a consequence of the inner laws of development of the Russian Revolution, but a purely external and contingent fact in relation to them. In this, the Debornists are following Plekhanov, who likewise allows contingency, quote, only at the point where necessary processes intersect, end quote. Footnote. A similar concept of, quote, contingency, end quote, is frequently to be met with in modern philosophy. Heinrich Schmidt defines chance as, quote, the occurrence of unforeseen, unintended events, themselves causally conditioned, their causally unconditioned encounter with other events, the, quote, intersection of one causal nexus with another, end quote. Eisler, end quote. Heinrich Schmidt. End footnote. Later Soviet philosophy does not, indeed, reject this account, but lays emphasis rather on the interconnection between necessity and contingency and their mutual transformation into one another. This interconnection between necessity and contingency resides in the fact that the contingency represents a manifestation, or as Engels puts it, a completion of necessity. Necessity pursues necessity's course through an endless host of accidents. It issues as a general tendency, or pattern of evolution, from out of a mass of aberrations from the main line of development. It emerges statistically from these contingencies, i.e., as the means of a large number of facts which deviate from this mean, end quote. The concept of necessity is based on a remark made by Marx in the third volume of Capital, where he asserts that under capitalist conditions of production, general laws only manifest themselves in prevailing tendencies. But it is not disputed that this concept of necessity also holds good of the Soviet order of society. Even a socialist planned economy is not immune from accidents. Harvests, for example, are necessarily governed by meteorological conditions. To be sure, the mutual relationships of necessity and contingency within Soviet society are held to be fundamentally different from those under capitalism, for under socialism economic necessity operates not as a blind elemental force, but as a necessity consciously taken into account. The internal connection of necessity and contingency is also seen in this, that under specific conditions the contingent becomes necessary. Darwin has shown how in the evolution of organisms, chance variations may under certain circumstances come to figure as essential changes which can actually lead to the formation of a new type. If such originally accidental deviations prove useful to the organism in the struggle for existence, these chance effects are preserved in the course of the evolutionary process by natural selection, are hereditarily transmitted, and indeed may eventually become essential attributes. This theory of Darwin's provides, in Engels' opinion, a practical proof of the correctness of the Hegelian view that necessity and contingency are internally connected. Marx makes a rather similar observation in Capital with regard to social life. Originally under a barter economy, the exchange of commodities between individual members of the clan was largely a matter of chance. In time, however, it became increasingly frequent and eventually developed into a necessary form of human relationship, which at the same time the system of bartering dropped out of sight as a contingent feature, a relic of a bygone age. In many accounts of Soviet dialectical materialism, the problem of freedom is also dealt with in this connection. Engels concurs with Hegel's notion of freedom as, quote, the appreciation of necessity, end quote. Quote, freedom does not consist in the dream of independence of natural laws, but in the knowledge of these laws, and in the possibility this gives of systematically making them work towards definite ends, end quote. Anti-Düring. Quote, freedom of the will, therefore, means nothing but the capacity to make decisions with real knowledge of the subject, end quote. Anti-Düring. Plekhanov calls this definition of freedom as consciousness of necessity, quote, one of the most brilliant discoveries ever made by philosophical thought, end quote. Plekhanov. This concept can only be grasped by those who are really capable of thinking philosophically, and even they will do so only, quote, when they have cast off dualism and realize that, contrary to the assumption of the dualists, there is no gulf between subject and object, end quote. Plekhanov, in The Role of the Individual in History, Essays in Historical Materialism, published in English in 1940. End footnote. This ontological unity of subject and object leads Plekhanov to the conclusion that in the consciousness of the acting subject, necessity coincides with freedom, and freedom with necessity. The consciousness of a lack of free will presents itself only in the form of a, quote, complete subjective and objective impossibility of acting differently from the way I am acting, and when at the same time my actions are to me the most desirable of all other possible actions, then in my mind necessity becomes identified with freedom, and freedom with necessity, and then I am unfree only in the sense that I cannot disturb this identity between freedom and necessity, cannot feel the restraint of necessity, but such a lack of freedom is at the same time its fullest manifestation, end quote. Plekhanov. Plekhanov begins the exposition of his concept of freedom by observing that history shows how theories which have held human conduct to be wholly governed by necessity, and even outspokenly fatalistic doctrines, have not only been no hindrance to exceptionally energetic action in practical life, but have actually been a psychologically necessary basis for such action. He points, for example, to the followers of Muhammad, who in a short space of time subjugated an enormous part of the globe stretching from India to Spain, to the Puritans who in energy excelled all the other parties in England in the 17th century, to Calvinism, to men like Cromwell, who regarded his actions as the fruits of the will of God, etc. By the same token, the Marxist doctrine that the due development of capitalism must necessarily lead to its own collapse and the setting up of a socialist order of society in no way serves as a psychological obstacle to energetic action and free participation in the process. On the contrary, the revolutionary feels himself an instrument of historical necessity and consciously puts himself at historical necessity's service. The revolutionary cannot help doing so, in fact, owing to his social status and his mental and moral temperament. The revolutionary passionately desires to serve as an instrument of necessity and cannot help desiring to do so. This was the psychological mood expressed in Luther's, quote, "Here I stand, I can do no other," end quote, a mood in which lack of free will is tantamount to a complete incapacity for inaction. Quote, "This is an aspect of freedom, and moreover a freedom that has grown out of necessity, i.e., to put it more correctly, it is freedom that is identical with necessity. It is necessity transformed into freedom," end quote. This being wholly in keeping with the Hegelian conception of freedom. Quote, "Necessity does not become freedom because necessity vanishes, but only because their, as yet inner identity is manifested," end quote. A freedom so conceived leads to liberation from the moral restraint which curbs the energy of those who have not yet been able to cast off dualism, who are unable, quote, "to bridge the gulf between ideals and reality." Unlike the individual has won this freedom by heroic effort in philosophical thinking, he does not fully belong to himself, and his mental tortures are the shameful tribute he pays to external necessity that stands opposed to him. But as soon as this individual throws off the yoke of this painful and shameful restriction, he is born for a new, full, and hitherto never experienced life, and his free actions become the conscious and free expression of necessity, end quote. Plekhanov also appeals to this connection to Hegel, who in another passage, quote, "very finely," end quote, remarks, quote, "Freedom is just this, namely the ... willing of nothing except itself," end quote. All these above quotes were from Plekhanov, but this last one was from Hegel, cited by Plekhanov. Plekhanov believes the synthesis of free action and necessity in this historical process to be realized in this, that the free activity of the historical individual represents an inevitable link in the chain of inevitable events. The more the individual is imbued with consciousness of this fact, the less he wavers and the more resolute are his actions. Plekhanov does not indeed exclude the possibility that the individual may weaken and fail to do his share in realizing the inevitable process, but he is optimistically convinced that in such a case, another individual, aroused perhaps by the very apathy of the first, will take his place, determined to perform what necessity requires. The general course, the overall tendencies in history, transcend the influence of historical accidents and the collaboration or non-participation of particular individuals, since they are determined by forces of an entirely different kind. Economic relationships. The personal element can alter the individual shape and particular details of the historical process, but not its general course. These Plekhanovian speculations about freedom are philosophically the most important that Soviet dialectical materialism has so far produced on this subject. For the rest, the doctrine of freedom in dialectical materialism is not primarily concerned with the freedom of the individual. Just as in the total structure of Marxist philosophy, generally the individual human personality retires into the background, the discussion being confined solely to nature and society. So too, the Marxist ideal of freedom refers not to the private freedom of the isolated individual, but to the, quote, freedom of social man in relation to nature and the laws of his own social development. His entire historical process constitutes, in the Marxist view, a continuing ascent of humanity to an ever more perfect freedom. Man's ancestors, originally in total subjection to nature, began by the employment of tools to subdue nature to themselves and to free themselves from her tutelage. The continued improvement of the means of production has meant a progressive liberation of mankind from their enslavement to nature, but has led nonetheless to a new enslavement of men at the hands of one another. With increasing complexities of production, the social relationships of production and the laws of social development have also become more complicated. The consequence has been that productive relationships have slipped out of man's control, this being particularly true of the capitalist order of society. The result is an anarchy of production leading to economic crises, unemployment, wars, etc. But Marxism will also serve to liberate mankind from this final form of slavery By uncovering the laws of social development, it offers social man the means of consciously guiding his own development. Quote, the seizure of the means of production by society puts an end to commodity production and therewith to the domination of the product over the producer. Anarchy in social production is replaced by conscious organization on a planned basis, ... And at this point, in a certain sense, man finally cuts himself off from the animal world, leaves the conditions of animal existence behind him, and enters conditions which are really human, ... The laws of his own social activity, which have hitherto confronted him as external, dominating laws of nature, will then be applied by man with complete understanding, and hence will be dominated by man, ... The objective external forces which have hitherto dominated history will then pass under the control of men themselves. It is only from this point that men, with full consciousness, will fashion their own history, ... It is humanity's leap from the realm of necessity into the realm of freedom, ... Engels, Anti-Düring. It will be seen that dialectical materialism conceives of the problem of freedom in a purely social sense. The question which properly belongs under this head, namely the free will of the individual as a personality, does not interest dialectical materialism, and is dismissed in contemptuous phrases, and here it is not only the philosophical problem that is thrust aside, but even the thing itself, namely individual freedom, the manner in which the individual is thereby unconditionally delivered over to the community, emerges very clearly from a recent Soviet study on the problem of freedom and necessity. Quote, dialectical materialism unmasks the typical view of contemporary bourgeois philosophy, which regards personality as something supposedly free from social and national conditions, absolutely enclosed in itself, tragically alone, and retaining its pure individual content, independent of the social environment. The nature of man consists not in any sort... Excuse me, where am I? Fuck. Oh my god. I don't know where I accidentally pressed skip a page as opposed to go down. I'll just have to repeat some shit. The manner in which the individual is thereby unconditionally delivered over to the community emerges very clearly from a recent Soviet study on the problem of freedom and necessity. Quote, dialectical materialism unmasked the typical view of contemporary bourgeois philosophy, which regards personality as something supposedly free from social and national conditions, absolutely enclosed in itself, tragically alone, and retaining its pure individual content, independently of social environment. The nature of man it consists, not in any sort of abstraction, quote, free will, etc., belongs to the isolated individual, but in the totality of social relations. As Lenin says, one cannot live in society and be free from society. But just as it is impossible for a personality to exist in isolation, so also is it impossible for the will to exist as something purely individual, absolutely and exclusively, quote, mine. The Marxist-Leninist solution of the problem of the mutual relations of personality and society reveals the social content of the personal. The materialist conception of the real individual in this real community with other men does away with any sort of idealist or metaphysical notion of the freedom of the will, ... It is not from itself alone that the human will acquires the capacity for freedom, for this will also, says Engels, itself become what it is by virtue of a mass of particular vital circumstances. Unlike the legendary Munchausen, man cannot pull himself out of the water by his own hair. His consciousness reflects the social being of the class to which he belongs. Here the dialectic of personal and social lies in the fact that the more a personality constitutes himself a conscious and active member of the progressive class, the more he grows in individuality and becomes capable of freedom, being in no way leveled down by this, as the reactionary sociologists attempt to show. End quote. T.I. Oiserman, in an article or book titled The Marxist-Leninist Solution of the Problem of Freedom and Necessity. The problem of determinism has long been one of the most puzzling features of the Marxist system of thought. How is the preaching of, quote, iron laws of development, end quote, to be reconciled with the demand that all energies be enlisted in the, quote, last decisive struggle, end quote, for emancipation of the working class and the abolition of all class distinctions? The conflict between these two factors was still further exacerbated by the personality of Lenin, the outspoken man of action who laid the greatest emphasis on zasnatelnost, which implies not merely, quote, consciousness in the sense of an act of the cognitive faculty, but rather, quote, deliberation, conscious willing, a deliberate striving and fighting, unswervingly directed towards definite goals. Dialectical materialism attempts to break the sovereign sway of determinism by propagating a, quote, dialectical determinism, in which necessity and contingency are bound together in dialectical unity. On the one hand, the contingent is necessary, since it is causally conditioned. On the other hand, necessity results, not from an unalterable essence, but as a statistical law based on the contingency of individual instances. On closer examination, it appears, however, that, quote, contingency alone is of no avail in setting limits to the domain of, quote, necessity or determinism, since such contingency does not, in fact, represent an exercise of freedom. The accidental and the necessary can only be contrasted in one of two senses, either that in which, quote, accidental means, quote, causeless, or that in which the accidental is equated, as it is in Hegel, with the contingent. If, quote, accidental were to be understood in the first sense, the reign of determinism would indeed be broken, but this would also impugn, I don't know how to say this, impugn, the universal validity of the causal principle, which, as we have seen, would be no more acceptable to dialectical materialism than it is to us. The meaning of, quote, accidental is accordingly rejected. The only remaining possibility, therefore, is to interpret the accidental as equivalent to the contingent. But then, however, the contingent acquires a certain hypothetical necessity. It can no longer fail to exist once the efficient causes conditioning it are put into effect. It is non-necessary only in the sense that it is brought about either by a rational cause operating freely within the universe, or else, if it is governed by a cause which does not belong to the sphere of spiritual being, in the sense that it forms part of a universe that does not necessarily exist. Hence it becomes clear that contingency only sets a limit to necessity insofar as the contingent gives expression to some kind of freedom, whether it be the freedom of a spiritual being within the world, or the free intervention of a supra-mundane cause, which makes intelligible the actual existence of our whole contingent universe, existing as it does without any basis of inner necessity. Footnote. That contingency ultimately points to freedom of some kind can be seen even from the examples ironically cited by Engels against determinism of the 5 peas in a pod and the flea bite. That this pea pod should contain 5 peas and not 4 or 6 is in fact the immediate outcome of various mechanical, chemical, or biological processes actuated by natural necessity. But that I should have picked just this pea pod and not some other pea pod, that the gardener should have sown just this and not some other seedling in this and not some other less fertile bed, is no longer governed deterministically, since there are here already the free activity of rational beings intervenes. Quote, of the example of the flea bite, it may likewise be said that this occurrence is immediately conditioned by a series of objectively occasioning causes, of which it is the unambiguous effect. Here too in the animal kingdom, as also in the already mentioned example of the peas, drawn from the vegetable kingdom, a certain latitude is admitted, in that the causes which uniquely determine these effects are reckoned to include not only the external stimuli, but also the specific state of the reacting organism itself, but in this example also the series of objectively working causes is further interrupted. as before, by a number of factors deriving from free human activity, that I went to bed that night at such and such an hour, and not an hour earlier or later, that on the previous day I took the tram car on which I caught the flea, instead of going on foot, and more to the same effect. It thereby becomes obvious that the quote contingency in these examples is precisely due to the interpolation of intramundane free causes. End footnote. The accidental may, however, be understood in yet a third sense as that which has an efficient but not a final cause, i.e. as something which results from the coincidence of two phenomena, each of which, taken by itself, is occasioned by efficient causes, but whose coincidence is determined neither on natural grounds nor teleologically by an alien final cause. Plekhanov and the Dvorinists conceive of the accidental in this fashion. Certain consequences drawn by Soviet philosophy from this essentially correct notion of contingency are deserving of further and more detailed consideration. Firstly, it must be said that such a concept of contingency does not suffice, as the Soviet philosophers imagine, to limit the scope of determinism. For here the contingent is in fact causally conditioned, and hence in that sense necessary. And as we have previously observed, the power of necessity can only be broken by freedom. A further function assigned to contingency, so conceived, is that necessity is alleged to proceed from it. What Darwin maintained in the realm of biology, that modifications originally due to chance are retained in the morphological structures of the organism and transformed by way of the struggle for existence, natural selection and inheritance into necessary characteristics of the species. This law is adopted by dialectical materialism as a universal law of being, applicable to the whole of reality. Necessary laws emerge as average regularities from a multitude of lawless individual deviations from the norm. We touch here upon one of the most difficult problems in the modern philosophy of nature, which has been posed to us above all by quantum mechanics and the quote statistical laws laid down therein. How does quote chance give rise to law? It is not possible in the present context to investigate this whole problem in detail, but we must at least offer a few critical remarks on the way this conception of law is employed in dialectical materialism. A. Dialectical materialism attributes to the whole of nature ultimately the whole of reality, a state of affairs established in the field of biology. And here indeed we must leave open the question whether the formation of new species by way of natural selection and inheritance is actually proved. The prevailing opinion is in fact against it, but as to this it must be observed that in Darwin's postulated transition from chance to law, quote, necessity does not come about by a simple repetition of accidents, for contingency is transformed rather into necessity by natural selection and inheritance. The chance is supplemented in the process not only by the elements of frequency, but also by that of stability, but this is only possible in the realm of organic nature, and not in that of nature as a whole. B. It is false in any sense that all natural laws are of a statistical character. The essential impossibility of interpreting elementary processes within the individual atom in terms of strict dynamical causality is due, in effect, to an intrinsic uncertainty in the determination of two complementary quantities, the position and the velocity of the electron, owing to the dualism of wave and corpuscle. This uncertainty, however, is inversely proportional to the mass of the inert particles involved, and therefore disappears on the macrophysical scale. Hence not only the astronomical laws of motion, but also the minimum principles, the conservation theorems, and many other laws may be regarded not as statistical, but as strictly dynamical in character. The question whether all natural laws are essentially statistical is one of the most difficult problems in the contemporary philosophy of nature. Many scientists, especially those positivistically minded ones who deny the validity of the causal principle in the microphysical sphere, are inclined to regard all laws as statistical. Others, and Planck in particular, are firmly opposed to this view. Here we shall merely confine ourselves to observing that the practice of Soviet philosophy in treating all laws as alike statistically is extremely difficult to reconcile with Soviet philosophy's simultaneous and determined adherence to the universal validity of the causal principle. Footnote. On this, see A. Gatterer's book Das Problem des Statistischen Naturgesetzes, published in Innsbruck, 1924, who comes to the conclusion that natural laws of a statistical type can only hold good outside the field of biology within the macrocosm, but that this, however, cannot be the case unless events within the microcosm are governed by dynamical natural law. The same author summarizes his position as follows, quote, statistical laws of averages and the probability in the macrocosm, yet not in spite of this, but precisely because of it, exact dynamical laws of nature in the microcosm, hence not absolute, but only relative chance, end quote. End footnote. A third function assigned in Soviet philosophy to the concept of, quote, contingency and contingency's dialectical unity with necessity is that of accounting for finality in nature. Here, too, we cannot undertake to expound the problem of finality in nature at full length and must be content with a few critical remarks on the manner of its solution in dialectical materialism. It will be expedient in this connection to separate the field of inanimate nature from that of the animate. In animate nature, teleology is manifested chiefly in the adaptedness of organs to the performance of specific functions, notably in phenomena relating inter alia to the preservation of the individual or the species. The dialectical materialist account of finality, quote, chance, variations, initially of causal origin, which have proved themselves in life, are transmitted to posterity and acquired by the species, is already untenable on this ground alone, that in order to transform the, quote, chance, the unique, into the, quote, necessary, i.e. the permanent and law-abiding, it is obliged to invoke inheritance to explain the establishment of the acquired characteristic and its adoption by the species. But inheritance presupposes an organism already constituted as to its being, whereas finality must be taken to underlie the original constituting of such an organism. It is not a resultant phenomenon, but an original presupposition of the organic as such. So far as concerns the field of inanimate nature, however, the presence of teleology, of final as well as efficient causality, is contested. It is generally agreed, however, that even though there may be no reason to credit inanimate nature with finality in the properly Aristotelian sense, it does exhibit a, quote, order, evinced especially in the mathematical character of natural law, and one which, no less than finality, acquires explanation in terms of a supernatural intelligence. Footnote. See J. Zeiler's book, Philosophie der Unbelebten Natur of 1948, where after having quoted a number of scientists, such as Eddington, for example, quote, ... at that time, it was the general assumption that the creation was the work of an engineer, not of a mathematician, as in the fashion nowadays, end quote. Sets forth his own position in the following terms, quote, since these ideas, though formulable only in mathematical terms, are no less truly determinate of the occurrence and character of things than final causes are, they must be thought of either as causae exemplaris in the Platonic sense, or in the suggestion of F. Renoir as formal causes. At all events, it seems that one cannot deny these mathematical forms a genuine causal meaning, even though they are accessible only to mathematical thought, end quote. J. Zeiler. End footnote. Even from the standpoint of dialectical materialism, it is difficult to think of this order as having arisen, quote, by chance, as a byproduct of forces operating in a purely causal fashion. For the order in question includes the element of constancy, whose appearance in the process of transition from contingency to necessity is supposedly explained by dialectical materialism as due to such factors as, quote, natural selection and, quote, inheritance, which obviously do not apply, however, in the field of inanimate nature. To explain the, quote, cosmos, the inveterate constancy of the order prevailing throughout the world by virtue of the concurrence of innumerable causal sequences as the chance byproduct of a whole multitude of blindly operating efficient causes, would be much as if one were to maintain the fact that both hands of a clock point to 12 on the dial whenever the sun is at the zenith, to be wholly applicable on purely causal grounds, namely as the product of a chance coincidence of two effects, each of them determined purely by efficient causes, the one being due to the expansion of the clock spring and the other to the rotation of the earth. In general, we may say that the dialectical materialist doctrine of necessity and contingency does nothing to restrict determinism and tips the balance unequivocally in favor of necessity. The same is true of the relationship of necessity to freedom, in which the bias in favor of necessity is still more strongly in evidence. As regards the doctrine of freedom, we may begin by conceding to Plekhanov that a certain historical determinism, in the shape of a law and necessity governing the development of communities, does not necessarily rule out any sort of personal individual freedom. Thus one may think of the laws inherent in the development of the community as being in the nature of statistical laws, which do not call for a rigid determinacy in every individual case. Social laws with their historical necessity would then bear a certain analogy to the statistical laws governing the microcosm. Even so, there would be this difference in the statistical character of the two types of law, that in quantum mechanics the irregular behavior of the individual case must still, in the last resort, be causally determined in some way or other, even though this determinacy may be essentially beyond the physicist's comprehension, whereas in the case of statistical laws of historical development, the individual case is not causally determined at all, since here we are dealing with individuals of a spiritual kind, who are therefore equipped with free will. It may indeed be granted as an element of truth in the Marxist conception of history that the personal freedom of the individual agent is not necessarily bound to exclude a certain necessity of lawfulness capable of formulation in historical laws within the development of the community as a whole. It needs emphasizing here, however, that this historical necessity should not be construed in too absolute a sense. This fact is, rather, that despite its, quote, statistical character, and unlike the statistical laws of physics, there still remains the fundamental possibility that it may be broken through from below in virtue of the personal freedom of individuals, as for instance by way of an intensification of the moral pressure exerted by the mass of private individuals. But though we may accept with reservations Plekhanov's claim that individual freedom is not inconsistent with a certain determinism at the communal level, the philosophical reasons Plekhanov gives for this, in common with Engels and Hegel, must nevertheless be rejected. Not that we wish to maintain by this that the concept of freedom so formulated is in itself untenable, i.e. the notion of freedom as a, quote, conscious and free expression of necessity, end quote, presupposing a transcendence of that dualism of subject and object, by which the subject is confined, as in the case of Hegel's, quote, freedom is, the will of nothing except itself, end quote. But such a concept of freedom presupposes an infinite being in whom there is no room for such limitation by an external object standing over against capital H, him, and for whom, therefore, the Hegelian, quote, willing of nothing except itself, end quote, could be wholly valid. Only in such a case would the situation be realized, which Plekhanov assumes to be wholly self-evident, that actions directed to the realization, establishment of necessity, should at the same time be those most desirable to the subject who performs them. But all this has no application to our empirical world or to the actual freedom of man acting in history. It would need a powerful measure of optimism to maintain, say, that a revolutionary fighting to establish the dictatorship of the proletariat would find exile and imprisonment, or even, it may be, the loss of his own life, quote, the most desirable of all possible actions, end quote. If the attainment of such goals be really the most desirable as well as the most necessary of activities, why all the vast output of persuasion and revolutionary propaganda in order to induce people to lend their, quote, free support to the realization of such, quote, necessary goals? It is also a piece of wholly unwarranted optimism, and one which plainly discloses the actual contingency of particular historical events, to maintain that if one individual, quote, fails in refusing to lend the support required of him to the realization of the necessary goal, another individual aroused by this very failure will infallibly spring into the breach. We thus certainly do not wish to deny that Plekhanov's concept of freedom as necessary self-acquiescence is an inherently possible one, but it presupposes an infinite absolute being. It is the concept of freedom which we find realized in God, in whom the necessity of his own self-willing coincides with complete freedom, is, quote, transfigured into freedom, end quote. But in our earthly fallen condition, to speak of freedom as, quote, consciousness of necessity, end quote, ultimately means nothing else in practice than a denial of individual freedom and its deliverance into the power of what remains, despite all the professions of dialectical materialism with regard to, quote, contingency and, quote, freedom, a still unbroken universal determinism. New section, Section 4, Possibility and Actuality. As with Aristotle and the Scholastics, becoming and development are interpreted by dialectical materialism as a transformation of the possible into the actual. In spite of this, the Soviet authors applaud dialectical materialism as having, quote, for the first time in the history of philosophy, provided a scientific solution to the problem of possibility and actuality. End quote. I.A. Grudinin, in an article titled, or book titled, Dialectical Materialism on Possibility and Actuality. In the development of the concept of actuality among the Soviet philosophers, it is possible, particularly in earlier years, but to some extent also in contemporary discussions of the problem, to trace the influence of the Hegelian concept of the, quote, rationality of the actual, end quote. In the first edition of the Great Soviet Encyclopedia, Shcheglov emphasized in defining the concept of the, quote, actual, that it means, quote, something deeper than the mere factual presence of individual things or their immediate external existence. The category of actuality already includes within its content an expression of the totality of all the internal and external moments. The reciprocal relationships of all these aspects which go to make up objective reality. The category of actuality gives expression to the objective world, conceived as a necessary, internally conditioned process governed by law. End quote. A. Shcheglov. In order to be actual, therefore, it is not enough that a thing should in fact exist. Just as with Hegel, not everything that exists is therefore actual on that account, but only that which can be regarded as the actualization of an idea, so too in dialectical materialism, only that is actual which comes to pass out of inner necessity in the course of the world's process of development and is in accordance with the inner law of that development. In the preface to his Philosophy of Right, Hegel made the famous statement, Quote, what is real is actual, and what is actual is rational, end quote. Let me repeat that. Quote, what is rational is actual, and what is actual is rational, end quote. Hegel. Many of his disciples have taken this remark, thanks, so it is believed in Soviet philosophy, to its, quote, idealist mode of utterance, as an endorsement of all currently existing social arrangements. In Germany, the Hegelian right construed this maxim as a justification of the Prussian monarchy. In Russia, Belinsky employed the same argument for a time in defense of the rigid absolutism of Nicholas I. The Soviet philosophers, however, are ready on occasion to allow that Hegel himself, in his Logic and Encyclopedia at least, interprets this principle in a revolutionary sense. Although at a given moment an idea may appear to be in conflict with the established order, it may yet be actual if it gives expression to a still unrealized, but inevitable, tendency of historical development. And by contrast, an established order may nonetheless be unactual, i.e., without a title to existence, if it lacks rationality and fails to correspond to an idea. Dialectical materialism seeks to translate this principle from its idealist context into a materialistic one by substituting, quote, historically necessary, end quote, in place of, quote, rational. Quote, everything rational, or in materialist terms, everything historically necessary becomes actual, end quote. M.B. Mitten. Here, for the first time, it becomes possible to see what is meant when the category of actuality is associated in recent Soviet treatments of the subject with those of necessity and law. Quote, the category of actuality is inseparably bound up with the categories of necessity and law. ... Marxist philosophy maintains that any given actuality is brought about through the operation of definite objective laws, end quote. Rosenthal Strax. Two people there. This is not to imply that the role of contingent factors is thereby excluded, but their effect is limited to modifying the actual in matters of subordinate detail. But dialectical materialism was not content merely to reiterate the Hegelian thesis in a materialist terminology. The simple assertion that everything actual is historically necessary proved insufficient, for the emergence of such tendencies as economism and mechanism in Russian Marxism made it necessary to guard historical materialism against the danger of lapsing into fatalism. Otherwise, Stammler would have been right in seeking to dispose of Marxism by ironical argument that if historical necessity guarantees the arrival of socialism, there can be no need to exert oneself in bringing it about, for nobody would ever dream of founding a party in order to bring on a lunar eclipse. The need to dissociate itself from a fatalist conception of historical determinism has given Soviet philosophy occasion to investigate the category of possibility as well as that of actuality, and also to inquire into the conditions under which the possible becomes actual. The fatalism of the mechanist was due to the fact that the mechanist identified possibility with actuality, was due to the fact that the fatalism of the mechanist was due to the fact that the mechanist identified possibility with actuality. Hence, the realization of socialism, in their view, must necessarily come about by itself, by way of samotek, quite apart from human activity. As against this, Stalin makes it perfectly clear in his report to the 16th Party Congress that possibility does not mean the same thing as actuality, and that it requires a number of conditions for its realization, of which human activity is the most essential. Quote, the Soviet system provides colossal possibilities for the complete victory of socialism. But possibility is not actuality. Possibility is not actuality. To transform possibility into actuality, a number of conditions are needed, among which the party's line and the correct carrying out of this line play by no means the least role. ... To convert possibility into actuality, we must first of all cast aside the opportunist theory of things going of their own accord, samotek. We must ... conduct a determined offensive against the capitalist elements in town and country, end quote. Stalin. But if dialectical materialism refuses on the one hand to identify the possible with the actual, it also guards itself on the other against the opposite extreme of cleaving an absolute gulf between possibility and actuality, as was done by Spinoza, Kant, and others. The new actuality originates in the first place as a possibility in the womb of the old. Possibility is a necessary condition for the emergence of a new actuality. In order to steer a middle course between mechanist identification of possibility and actuality and the idealist absolute separation between them, dialectical materialism again follows Hegel in distinguishing between, quote, abstract or, quote, formal and, quote, real possibility. The abstract, formal kind of possibility is that which, quote, rests merely on abstract thought constructions of formal logic, having no basis or precondition in objective reality, and lacking determination by the given historical development, end quote. M.V. Taranchuk. The Soviet philosophers agree with Hegel that nothing much can be done with this kind of possibility. In this sense, it is possible that the moon might fall to earth or an Indian Rajah become pope. Such abstract possibilities were also in their day considered to be exemplified in the, quote, equal opportunities which the British delegates demanded for all countries at the Danube Conference, and which were opposed by the Romanian representative Anna Pauker, when she argued that despite such, quote, equal opportunities, Romania, for example, had never established a commercial interest in Britain, France, or the USA, or imposed her will upon the Thames, the Seine, or the Mississippi, whereas Englishmen and Frenchmen were claiming to themselves a major sphere of influence on the Danube and in Romania. In contrast to this abstract possibility, real possibility, quote, has its ground in the given concrete historical circumstances, is evoked and determined by the existing actuality, and proceeds from the latter according to a necessary law, end quote. M.V. Taranchuk. Only such real possibilities can become actual. In his report on the draft constitution of the USSR, Stalin maintained that unlike the constitutions of bourgeois states, that of the USSR did not confine itself to stating the formal rights of citizens, but stressed the guarantees of these rights and the means by which they could be exercised. The equality of the citizens, for example, is guaranteed by the abolition of exploitation, the right to work by the liquidation of crises, unemployment, etc. As to the relationships between these two types of possibility, it is held that, quote, abstract possibility may, under certain conditions, become concrete, as with the dreams of earlier generations regarding flight, and contrariwise, the real possibility may again become abstract. As for the transition from possibility to actuality, this is brought about in nature on a basis of necessary law, through the operation of blind elemental forces. But that is not the case in social life, where the transformation of the possible into the actual is assisted by the conscious activities of men. Consciousness, therefore, has a part here. Men set themselves specific goals and struggle to achieve those specific goals. Nevertheless, in antagonistic societies, the end product of historical development is not what was aimed at by men in their conscious activity. It comes about unconsciously, through natural necessity, and, regardless of the subjective aims of the individuals concerned, for the inhabitants of such a society neither have nor can have any common will. In the socialist classless society, however, the case is altered, for there, thanks to the moral and political unity of the people and its common will, the end product of historical development, the translation of the possible into the actual, is accomplished by means of a planned and conscious effort. The translation of possibility into actuality therefore calls for, quote, the union of objective possibility with purposeful and skilled human activity, end quote. This statement is directed on the one hand against, quote, fatalism, the economist's theory of Stikhianost, Bukharin's of Samotek, which has overlooked the subjective element, the importance of active conscious intervention on the part of man, and on the other against subjectivism, the, quote, heroic theory of the Narodniks, Trotsky's ultra-revolutionary adventurism, which has underestimated the importance of objective possibilities. What chiefly occasioned the development of this whole theory in its day was the controversy as to whether it was possible to realize socialism in one country. Stalin, of course, decided that there was such a possibility. In Stalin's view, as we know already, the Soviet system offers enormous possibilities for the complete victory of socialism, but if these possibilities are to be translated into actuality, crucial importance attaches to the work of the Bolshevik Party and the Soviet state, the subjective factor in general, the will, determination, vigor, and efficiency of organizations, and the like. The building of socialism in one country, a possibility which has been actualized in the USSR, creates in turn the necessary conditions for the actualization of communism in a single country also. It is an indication of the continuity in the ideological field, despite the de-Stalinization campaign, that Khrushchev, in his report to the 20th Party Congress, should have adopted almost word for word the Stalinist formula of the transformation of possibility into actuality. In speaking of the real possibility that the sixth five-year plan might be not only fulfilled but over-fulfilled, Khrushchev observes, quote, "However, as everyone knows, possibilities are not yet realities," end quote. To transform them into actuality would require hard work on the part of all Soviet organizations and strenuous endeavors from the entire Soviet people. The Soviet philosophical discussions of the categories of possibility and actuality deserve the closest attention. The basic idea involved, that motion and development represent a transition from the possible to the actual, is a perfectly sound one. It is also correct to emphasize that these two categories must certainly be distinguished, for if the possible and the actual were to coincide, this would not only make a non-fatalistic conception of development impossible, but would, in general, rule out all development, process, or becoming in the world, leaving only pure actuality or necessary being. There is much of value in the insight here attained by dialectical materialism, namely that possibility does not become actual of itself alone, requiring rather the intervention of a cause to enable it to do so. In the realm of conscious human activity, this necessity has been clearly worked out by dialectical materialism. It is less clear in its allusions to nature, where the transition from the possible to the actual is said to be effected by the, quote, elemental power of natural forces, end quote. Rosenthal Strex. For if the possible and the actual are not to coalesce in a necessary being, but are to part company in a mutual tension, thereby leaving room for becoming, necessary or otherwise, what is needed, whether we are dealing with human affairs or with necessary occurrences in nature, is the operation of something else, itself already actual, whereby possibility may be transformed into actuality. A further notable vista opens up at this point, for since this additional third thing will doubtless itself be undergoing development of some sort, and thus be in a certain respects a, quote, possibility, in process of becoming, quote, actual, it too will in turn require a further thing, and since we cannot go on indefinitely in this fashion, without leaving the entire motion of all these intermediaries hanging in the air, we must necessarily light somewhere upon a thing of this sort, in which possibility and actuality coalesce in the form of necessary being, which is therefore responsible for setting in motion the whole of the world's process of development. Thus, Stalin's, quote, possibility is not actuality, end quote, still ends by leading us back to that, quote, first mover, which dialectical materialism is so assiduously anxious to avoid. New section, Section 5, Form and Content. These two categories also form part of the stock and trade of dialectical materialism. In the days of Stalinism, when the theory of categories had no place of its own within the system of Soviet philosophy, these categories were gradually dealt with in connection with the fourth principal feature of the dialectic, the law of the unity and struggle of opposites. Content in Soviet philosophy is held to be, quote, the most important aspect of the object, that which characterizes the object's very essence, the basis which emerges in the properties and features of the object, end quote. Form, on the other hand, is, quote, the internal organization of the content, that which binds the elements of the content into unity, and in whose absence the content itself is impossible, end quote. The definition given in the collective book categories of the materialist dialectic is even more obscure and less exact. Thus, in the atom, for example, the elementary particles represent the content and their arrangement the form. In the organism, it is the cells and organs on the one hand, and their organizational and specific structure on the other. In social production, content is provided by the productive forces and formed by the relations of production. In mental activity, the thought is the content and the world the form. In literary and artistic production, content consists in the social relations expressed. Labor, the class struggle, while form resides in the composition, the subject, the language, and so on. In contrast to, quote, metaphysics, which is accused of setting up form as something external and alien to its content, dialectical materialism proclaims a dialectical unity between the two categories. Every object has its form and its content. There is no content absolutely without form, just as there is no form without content. But within this unity, content has priority as the determining element. As against this, however, form in turn has an effect upon content, albeit in a secondary fashion, being itself dependent on content. Once it has arisen, it does not remain passive, but exercises an active influence on the development of content. Literature and art, provided they combine wealth of idea content with power of artistic form, may come to be factors of enormous significance in the historical process. The dialectical unity of form and content only emerges in its character of contradictoriness when form and content are regarded not as static, but as dynamic features in the developmental process of the object. Up to a certain stage of development, content may go on developing unhindered within the framework of a given form, but then a point is reached beyond which the old form begins to fetter the further development of the content. The contradiction between the two thereupon makes itself felt and struggles to resolve itself, and this is finally effected by the old form being cast aside and giving place to a new, quote, conflict of content and form, and vice versa, discarding of form, transformation of content, end quote, such as Lenin's formulation of the 15th element in dialectic. The classical example of this dialectic is the contradiction between the development of productive forces and that of the relations of production, of which Marx speaks in his, quote, classical formulation of the materialist conception of history in the introduction to his Critique of Political Economy. In the development of productive forces, there comes a moment when the existing relations of production change from forms of development of the forces of production into fetters hampering their further progress. This ushers in a period of social revolution in which the relations of production are transformed. Thereafter, the new relations of production have a stimulating effect in turn on the development of the productive forces, this being taken by Soviet philosophy to confirm the thesis of the active role which form also plays in relation to content. Another example of the dialectical relationship between form and content is invariably quoted from Lenin, though it is perhaps less interesting in this context of formal dialectics than in regard to other questions which it raises. Lenin applies the categories of form and content to democracy also, and maintains at one point that Soviet democracy represents a new form of democracy, but again elsewhere that it also involves a new content. In the course of centuries, so Lenin argues, the forms of democracy change. It would therefore be the height of foolishness to suppose that the greatest of all revolutions in the history of mankind could take place within the framework of the old bourgeois conception of democracy, quote, without creating new forms of democracy, end quote. Lenin, the First Congress of the Communist International. On the other hand, however, Soviet democracy is novel, not only in form but also in content, and the new content of this new form of democracy consists, in fact, in the destruction of classes. Quote, the proletariat needs the abolition of classes, such as the real content of proletarian democracy, of proletarian freedom, proletarian equality. He who has failed to understand that this is the content of the dictatorship of the proletariat, takes the name of the dictatorship of the proletariat in vain. End quote. Lenin, Tasks of the Third International. This is a noteworthy admission For a proletarian democracy differs alike in form and content from democracy as hitherto understood, one may legitimately ask what the two kinds of democracy continue to have in common, apart from the name itself. The chief thing to be complained of about the dialectical materialist treatment of this pair of categories is again the lack of accuracy in the framing of definitions. There is no means of seeing from the definitions provided how the category of, quote, content differs in any way from that of, quote, essence, and a definition certainly ought to be so formulated that it applies only to the definendum. Nor is there any justification for the accusation leveled against metaphysics that metaphysics separates form from content. At the very least, it should be stated more clearly to whom this objection refers. Aristotle, indeed, from whom the framing of this pair of categories derives, though he used the term, quote, matter instead of, quote, content, envisaged the unity between these two principles of being in a manner which might well have served as an example to dialectical materialism. In his view, neither form nor matter could exist separately, but only in the unity of the material substance constituted by them. It is therefore incomprehensible that he should be accused of supposing that form could exist prior to matter. Here we may conclude our sketch of the theory of categories. In expounding it, we have confined ourselves to those categories which already form part of the traditional stock of dialectical materialism. As we have seen from the list of categories given at the outset, there are wide variations as between one author and another. The straightening out of this portion of dialectical materialist theory has only just been resumed in Soviet circles, and hence is still too much in flux to yield, as yet, any generally accepted arrangement or detailed exposition of category theory. And that is the end of Chapter 4 of Part 2 of Gustav A. Vetter's Dialectical Materialism, a Historical and Systematic Survey. Thank you so much for listening.